In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers and readers and listeners and patrons and non-patrons and everyone. I'm Douglas Lain.
And I'm Ashley Frawley.
And you're Ashley Frawley. And we are here this week to talk about why it is so difficult to grow up under modern capitalism. That's the topic on the thumbnail this week. But before we jump into that topic, I want to point out that Ashley here has just started a new series of videos on our channel. It's called Based as AF, not as F, but Based AF. And Ashley, how did you come up with that title, and what is this new series about?
So I asked around. Well, somebody said like long time ago during like lockdown, a friend of mine was saying, "Oh, you need to do live streams." And I was like, "No, it takes a lot of preparation. I don't want to, just mouth off and that kind of thing." And he's like, "Oh, come on, we'll just do one." So I did one, like kind of, it wasn't live, but I just sort of responded to some questions on my my YouTube, and I thought, oh, I'll do this as a series, or if I do it as a series, what should I call it? And I asked that on Twitter, and that was the most common, suggestion was Based AF, which sounds so hilarious when I say it out loud. So I'm going to try my best not to say it out loud ever, because I'm way too old. And also I have a new camera, which is supposed to be high definition. And I'm very, very aware that now you can probably see like in all detail my slow descent. Anyways, yeah, so it's Based AF. The other one, what other ones did people suggest? Oh, I can't remember now. It was something like, Drunk AF.
Well, you don't want to give yourself an excuse to regularly get drunk on the internet.
I know, but it's fun. So that was the other one. I thought, you know what? If I don't want to go and like spout my mouth off on the internet, then I should probably definitely not do Drunk AF. But that would have been in a world in which cancel culture doesn't exist and we can all spout off and say stupid things. Then yes, I would.
You can find that world down at your local pub every day of the week, I think.
True that. Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, with what we've been talking about recently, and we've been for a few months, but we really tried to focus and come up with a plan recently, is turning Sublation Media into a company that is developing research projects. Maybe it doesn't have just one research project defining it, but that is developing avenues of investigation where rather than just eclectically taking shots at and having hot takes on everything that comes up, instead we actually try to collectively deepen our understanding for ourselves and people who are watching. And this month of March, even though it's still February, we're tackling the question of subjectivity. And there's a variety of ways to approach the question of subjectivity. From a socialist perspective, the question is like, who is the revolutionary subject, or where's that revolutionary subject gone? From a philosophical perspective, I guess you could ask questions like, what is it to be human, or what is human nature in a big sense? Or if you're a modern philosopher, you might ask, what conditions must prevail in order to create the kinds of subjects that we want to become, and so on. But the idea behind this, I think we're both feeling that human subjectivity has been under siege for a while. There's even a Rick Roderick lecture called the Subject Under Siege. One way to think about it is in terms of postmodernity and consumer capitalism. But overall, even amongst people on the left, there's a mistrust that's developed about everyday people having enough of an ability and sense of themselves, an ability to reason and a sense of themselves to cope with the world and handle it rationally, and be kind of, I'll call it bourgeois subjects. So we're going to be exploring that topic this month, trying to defend that kind of subjectivity, even as we expose why it's difficult to maintain, or what's undermining it today. Do you think did I do a fair summary of what we've been talking about, Ashley?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose when you think of like research projects, it sounds like I suppose it's the idea is to just have a kind of an orientation to some of our critical questioning so that we can come through hopefully with some answers. I think a lot of us at Sublation were kind of feeling like feeling a bit lost. Like we want to do something. We want to move discourses forward. We want to make sense of some of the most important questions of our times. And you can't really do that if you're just like, flying by the seat of your pants. Oh, what's in the news cycle this week? And so it's about trying to gradually build on some of our understandings and kind of flesh out some of these things. So yeah, how you've characterized the question of subjectivity and why it matters is really important, I think, and also characterizing it as a question of bourgeois subjectivity, because I think that's important. As I always say, people tend to kind of reject. They have this sense like, oh, well, bourgeois society wants us to be like X, so I'm going to be like Y, without realizing that these sorts of ideas were quite radical for their time. So if you think about, a good place to start might be to think about Kant's very sort of basic short article, What is Enlightenment? And enlightenment is when you free yourself from this self-imposed kind of childhood, this self-imposed infantilization. And you, as a child, your will, you're not autonomous. You are heteronymous. Your will is shaped by another, by your parents and so on, of necessity, right? As you learn about the world and make your way through it. But people throughout history kind of became or were they've lived out roles that allowed them to carry on that kind of heteronymous subjectivity. They were just, they played more or less a socioeconomic role. If you want to go to like really basic sociology, you had in pre-industrial societies mechanical solidarity, where everyone is, pretty much the same. And this is what keeps society together. People have their own kind of, everyone has the same religion. And yes, there's a certain division of labor and so on. But, if you're in a farming community, you're all pretty much farmers, that sort of thing. And so you can live your life as though you're just living a role. Obviously, Christopher Lasch said most people did not live, one of my favorite quotes, most people did not live historically as though they had one life to live. They lived as though they were living their parents' lives and their children's lives. It was more or less the same over and over and over again. Social reproduction, you were like a family of shoemakers or bakers or whatever for a very, very long period of time. And so people didn't sort of have a sense of so much of a sense of individuation that we do now in our societies, in which there's enormous differentiation, enormous role differentiation, and our societies are held together by how different everyone is and the enormous division of labor. And this allows for the possibility of a kind of enlightenment and a kind of individualization, which was really powerful for its time. And it allows somebody like Kant to start saying, well, what is enlightenment? It's when we're freed from this, he doesn't use this word in that particular text, I don't think, but freed from this sort of heteronymous subjectivity to become autonomous individuals, really for the first time, at least in several hundred years. And you could go back to like Greek state and that sort of thing. But this allowed us, there was this enormous accomplishment of modernity to allow us this kind of autonomous subjectivity where one could know thyself, one could dare to know, and in daring to know become something totally different, that you could sort of revolutionize yourself. as a subject. And, if we sort of carry on through the Enlightenment, through to someone like Marx, through understanding the world, revolutionize the whole basis of the world. So this is quite important, this kind of autonomous subjectivity, which I think a lot of people will reject now. People will say, oh, neoliberalism wants us to be like responsibilized autonomous subjects. I don't think it's that simple. I think actually that ideal of heteronomy, that ideal of sort of infantilization or self-imposed infantilization, where you have your will shaped by an outsider, is actually an ideal now. I think that's the idea that you would rely on yourself or your own networks, informal, non-expert networks, is really looked down upon as risky.
Yeah. I recall when I first started at Zero, I interviewed an author who, I forget the name of her book, but she was developing a new book about the concept of resilience, and critiquing this notion of resilience as a neoliberal cultural value.
It is, yeah.
The idea that, well, okay, but it seems to me that resilience is actually a bourgeois value, that people who have a good sense of self, and I said that Roderick had put together an essay, a lecture about the self under siege. I said subject under siege, and it was actually the self under siege. But having a strong ego identity, a good sense of yourself that could be resilient and hold up against the storm of changes that modern life produces is sort of has been for a long time an aim for good citizens. That you want to produce citizens who are resilient and have a strong sense of self, because they'll be able to in a mature way participate in a democratic society, and take responsibility for their own decisions and produce consistent values and so forth. And so why do you say that resilience is a neoliberal value?
Okay, so there are a couple of ways that you can approach this to critique it. And one thing, there's an enormous literature that critiques resilience, and I'm guessing that you spoke to. I'd like to know who it was actually that you spoke to. But anyways, so there's one critique that's like, oh, all of a sudden bourgeois society became obsessed with resilience, or it's probably been an ideal that's been around for a long time, but neoliberalism kind of rehashes it. And the reason is because it's trying to create these self-regulating autonomous subjects who will kind of, when bad things happen, will kind of bounce back and become basically what you've just said there. And what some people will do is they will react against that and say, no, this is what bourgeois society is trying to do, is trying to responsibilize us for shocks and things that go wrong, which is true. But then they kind of reject that, and they will emphasize and reify a vulnerable subjectivity as a way of trying to subvert that. So they'll be like, oh, neoliberal capitalism wants us to be resilient, but actually we are vulnerable, and it's important that we have these new kind of vulnerable subjectivities that are capable of sort of expressing our weaknesses, and it's okay to be weak and so on, or it's okay to kind of recognize your vulnerabilities as a kind of a subversion of that, essentially. But what they don't recognize is that, why does neoliberalism constantly seek to inculcate resilience? Why is that such a big thing? Like, you got to go into schools and inculcate resilience and give people grit and whatever it is. And why is there this whole industry that surrounds resilience? Well, there's a lot going on there. And I think my favorite author on this is David Chandler, who I've cited quite a lot in our discussions, but I also cite in my own work quite a lot. And I think he's probably really the best. He's the only person who's really got this down. And I will probably butcher the argument. But essentially, the hidden within the resilience discourse is not a notion of the subject as it exists in communities and people's informal networks and whatever, outside of institutions that are carefully controlled and so on. Subjects are not resilient there in their natural habitat, as you say, or in their natural or their already existing social context. They're not resilient. So we have to go in and we have to inculcate this resilience. And actually people might think that they might think that they are autonomous. They might think that they're capable of taking responsibility for bad things that happen, but that is not the case. And they're quite likely, the discourse goes, to screw things up. They're quite likely to be maladaptive. And like, let's say after a natural disaster, the basic understanding is that people will need, by default, external guidance, external sort of forms of expertise or therapeutic interventions and so on. And there's a tendency to downplay the kind of resilience that already downplay and also just like displace the forms of resilience that exist within those communities. For example, I always remember somebody sent me this where it was like after a natural disaster, they sent all these psychologists over. Can't remember where it was. I want to say Ghana, but I can't remember. Anyway, and they took each person into a tent and gave them like individualized sort of like therapeutic, probably trauma counseling. And this was like totally alien to the people. And they were like, no, after something bad happens, we as a community come together and we have all these rituals that we do. Like we drum and we dance, we do all these sorts of things. And we definitely don't individually think about what we're supposed to do. And these like external therapeutic sort of professionals came in and they were like, no, as a human, you are supposed to, you will be traumatized by this and you shouldn't suppress it. You should bring it up and you should talk about it. But in that person's culture, this was totally alien. You do these rituals to kind of heal and overcome as a community, and then you move forward. And this was just like totally alien to the therapeutic professionals. But what wound up happening is that this new way of thinking about oneself in relation to what happened supplanted the already existing resilience within the community, and also imputed or left behind this idea that because this bad thing happened, you are permanently marked, which was not something that existed in that particular culture before. And it's a shame that I can't remember the exact parameters of this example.
Was there some sort of social incentive to take up this new approach to overcoming the trauma? Were there benefits to playing along with these therapists?
Well, I don't know if it's benefits. You know, I would use a better example would be Vanessa Popovac's work. So she looks at this stuff about the kind of like therapeuticization of war and how war responses have been, and you know, war itself has become kind of therapeutized. That after a war, there's all these, or after any kind of disaster, there's all these interventions that come, and you know, they are this. It's associated with like rich Western nations and science and so on. And this is the correct way to heal. Not everybody takes this stuff up. In fact, there's a lot of pushback. So for example, Vanessa Popovac talks about how after a disaster, there are some cases in which before they even have help with finding their relatives, they are offered therapeutic interventions and they don't want them. They want help, you know, putting their lives back together and finding their loved ones first and foremost. But there's just this enormous like assumption that after something bad happens, you will need this sort of external kind of expertise to help you to cope. And so this is the kind of idea of resilience, is that the basic understanding of the human is that without this specialized knowledge and intervention, you are quite likely to become ill. That without this, human beings in their sort of existing cultures are maladapted, or likely to be maladapted, or are likely to make bad choices. And the outside, the people who have better access to information, the outside agency has to come in and inculcate resilience. And in addition, so it's a very kind of passive understanding of the subject. It's a subject that doesn't really act, well, when it acts on the world, it acts potentially destructively without sort of careful guidance. And you are resilient because you have to be resilient to this world that you can't really control. Chandler says something like, you must learn to live dangerously, live in a dangerous world, but never act dangerously. You must recognize that the exercise of your free will, of its own volition, within your own social context or whatever you learn from your family or your informal forms of socialization, is quite likely to be dangerous and destructive, and that you have to constantly be looking for outside guidance. So this is the ideal citizen, the resilient citizen. When something bad happens, they look for outside guidance, for a script on how to deal with it. You learn to recognize that if you just act in a dangerous situation, you are quite likely to screw things up. And you saw this in the response to COVID-19, for example. There was this widespread assumption that without the state telling you exactly what you had to do, people would just not act. That people didn't, and even the models were based on this, that people just don't act unless outside agencies do something or make them act or tell them to act. It's like people have no free will, no capacity for judgment. And actually, it's ideally that way. Ideally, people don't exercise their free will and their judgment without the careful honing of the outside expertise or expert.
I want to show a clip. I think I've shown it on the stream before. It's just sitting here in our video clip file. And it came to mind as you were describing all this. I want to also talk about, when we're on the other side of this clip, about the movie Brazil. Have you ever seen the movie Brazil by Terry Gilliam?
No.
That's fine. I'll just describe it. I'm sure people have. But here, I'm going to show this clip real quick.
I mean, in a certain way, one of the characteristics of what the self is, and one of the reasons it's under siege, is we're interpretive beings. And now, by the late 20th century, we're in a situation where interpretation has never been more difficult. Never been more difficult. I can name artifacts that we've developed technologically that are almost completely closed to interpretation, and I'll name one, although we attempt to interpret it. Television. Television tries to interpret itself to us, bypassing the upper brain functions and directly feeding into our minds. This is why I said off camera between classes that Orwell was a pie-eyed optimist. 1984 arrived in sort of the early 70s, and Orwell's vision of a horrible future, which was a boot stomping on a human face forever, is a utopian image because he assumed there would be resistance and human faces, both of which may turn out to be false. So, 1984 is not a book that scares me anymore. It's again, I know that last time I outrageously said that Herbert Marcuse was the Norman Vincent Peale of the 60s. And now this time I've been forced to say that Orwell was an optimist, a sort of my corollary to his little cautionary tale.
What did you make of that, Ashley? And then I'll tell you what I thought of it. Why?
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. Let me hear what you think of it first.
Well, first of all, this attitude, this concern about the loss of the subject, the way in which the world presents itself as uninterpretable, the fear that there is no resistance left or ability left in humanity due to things like television. Well, it started out and has a sort of a critical side to it. It's a critique of our culture. It's an attitude that you might want to take up if you're trying to change things. But on the other hand, it presumes that that people can't respond to the crisis of society in a rational way as already developed human beings. It's actually this idea, it's optimistic to think that someone like Winston would exist in society because he at least struggles against it. From a progressive point of view, you need to give Winston some therapy so that he could discover that Big Brother is oppressive. right? Before he could act in opposition. Of course, as a therapist, state mandated therapist, you would be working in cahoots with Big Brother, so everything's a little bit twisted. But I just watched yesterday this movie Brazil, which I wanted to bring up to you because it's a classic Terry Gilliam film. You should see it. You should, it's a science fiction film. It's old, I know, but it's a retelling of 1984. It's another one of these dystopian futures, and in it, the main character is a bureaucrat. There's a mistake in the system where the wrong man is arrested, a man named Buttle instead of a man named Tuttle. He gets stuck with this information, and for a variety of reasons, he gets ensnared into this ridiculous fantasy that the system itself is having about what's going on, about their own mistake. The upstairs neighbor of Buttle happens to look just like the woman that the bureaucrat has been dreaming about. So as he goes along, trying to just do his job, he gets and more involved because he thinks he's in love with this woman, who's the neighbor of the turns out dead man Buttle. And I was watching this movie with my son, and he kept saying things like, why does she like him at all? Why is he behaving so irrationally? How does this make sense? And the movie works like with a dream logic. It doesn't work with a real logic. But if you put that same bureaucrat into that role and had him insist that the system be as rational as it claimed, and did things like, oh, we need to track down how this error happened. We need to find out who's responsible for it. We need to intervene in this system because there clearly has been an error, and use the bureaucracy to correct itself. You would have had, you could have still told a story of how he ends up getting persecuted and chased down and has to stand up against the system, but it would have had a completely different tone. And it would have been one in which the main character was using the values of the society he was a part of against that society, rather than this story of a guy who's just wanting to survive and meet his own personal half-developed desires and aims. A guy who wants to. One of the plots of this is that he's sort of dominated by his mother throughout this. It's a guy who's trying to grow up, trying to be his own person. If you take that out of the story and you give him a strong ego identity, it becomes a very different story, and one I think which would have been maybe not as successful on one level as an entertainment, but which would have made Terry Gilliam, the writer, think more deeply about how this bureaucratic totalitarian system might actually arise, rather than just being almost assumed into, as our future and as assumed to be uninterpretable at base. Anyway, so that's what comes to mind for me is that, and if you make this story even worse, Brazil's also an optimistic story, because in Brazil, this neighbor witnesses the wrongful arrest of Buttle, and then she goes around trying to get someone to recognize it and to do something about it, and they just get angry with her and label her as a terrorist. But what they probably would have done if it was a modern contemporary version was offer her therapy for the trauma that she underwent, witnessed the arrest, and also possibly living with a terrorist like Buttle, even though in fact he wasn't a terrorist at all. Anyway, so I'll let you on that.
Well, yeah, I one thing that you said was interesting. You sort of like turned these ideals against the society itself. What did you mean by that?
Well, the bureaucracy has all these rules and regulations in order to make sure that things are done efficiently and fairly. You have in particular, there's in the movie Brazil, there is a war against terrorism going on throughout the whole movie, and you want to the system wanted to find the culprits and find the true culprits and stop the terrorist attacks and interrogate people to discover the truth. And so you would think that in a system like that, a rationalized system of surveillance and interpretation, that you would have means to correct mistakes, that there would be there's a process for everything, and they're always there for a reason. So, yeah, the bureaucracy of the paperwork is just seen as this uninterpretable villain in the story. But if you say, you know what, actually, I'm going to understand what each of these forms is for, why it exists, what's the rationale behind it, even if I have to trace it down historically because it's been distorted, and I'm going to try to use the process of the bureaucracy in order to get the truth of this wrongful arrest brought into the light, then you will end up being much more subversive than if you simply try to cheat your way to your supposed girlfriend from your dreams or whatever, which is what he does in the movie. So that's what I meant.
So, and applying that to our current situation, what would that translate to?
Well, let's see. In our current situation, we absolutely on the left should be concerned about where COVID-19 came from, and not just look the other way about and worry, and worry about who might be using one or another narrative around the origins of COVID to further some reactionary political ambition, or even to further some supposedly progressive political ambition. So the value of truth and scientific inquiry should actually guide us, I think, around the question of COVID, as an example.
See, now what I was thinking, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. That's just one.
So what I was thinking when you said that is sort of turning these ideals, like taking bourgeois society seriously, because what neoliberalism does is what I've been trying to explain for a long time in various ways, is that it doesn't just assume a kind of resilient subject or an autonomous subject or whatever. It destroys it before it can build it, and it's in forms that it thinks are rational because they're in service to political economy, or they're in service to capitalism or whatever. But people actually do. It says that whenever people act in ways that economists think they shouldn't, they're like, oh, well, there's this irrationality here, or not always, but quite often, especially when you look at like things like nudge and behavioral economics and so on. It's just like, oh, our primitive brains find it so difficult to live in this world, and that's why economists need to just give people a little nudge to be their better selves or whatever, and their better selves is whatever is serviceable to capitalism. And it's kind of, I do think that we kind of have to take capitalism's lie seriously and say, well, no, I am an autonomous thinking subject by virtue of being human. I do have that capability. I have the capacity to reflect on my experience, to use reason to do so, to exercise free will. And people do that. And I think we had a lot of difficulty accepting that, I think, because as I've said many times, there's been a sort of neoliberal takeover of large portions of the left, in which neoliberalism's obsession with safetyism and therapeutic governance has been mistaken for progressive leftist outlook, because people are railing against things that have been dead for 100 years or more. So they're like, oh, stiff upper lip or whatever. Well, maybe not 100 years, that particular one, but they're like, no, to be subversive, I need to champion vulnerability. And here's a discourse that champions vulnerability. It must be on my side. And so people really found it difficult to understand why there were these like crotchety people who refused that and who wanted a space in which they could exercise their free will, because for such a long time, freedom had been co-opted by the right. And the left got used to thinking about freedom as a right-wing thing and also as a risk, and had kind of adopted risk aversion, safetyism, and so on as sort of core left-wing beliefs. And so when there were people who were like, no, actually, I am capable of reflecting on my experience and rationally choosing how I'm going to live and how I'm going to judge things, people freaked out and lost their shit, including around vaccines. And it became like bound up with the older kind of anti-vax movement, as though people were the same people who were questioning this particular vaccine were the types that would question like measles vaccines and that sort of thing. So it all got bound up with this irrationality, this irrational, stupid Karen movement. When the people who were anti-vaccine or were questioning the vaccine kept saying like, no, I'm okay with all these other vaccines. I got them. Is this particular one I'm not sure about? And people really, really, really did not like that. And they were doing everything that they could to sort of wave their hands and say that. But I think this was, I know no one's going to like to hear this, especially not our listeners or our viewers. But this was people taking that seriously and saying, I am capable of exercising a judgment about what's going to go into my body, against this neoliberal onslaught, which was that, no, you can't do that. Your will must be carefully fashioned by external forces if it's going to be a good will, a will that is not destructive. And we are that's been the sort of discourse of neoliberalism, is that the unfashioned free will of just the uninitiated human is dangerous. You must learn to live in a dangerous world and to sort of like develop all of these capacities and so on to insulate yourself, or at least like not act destructively in that world. But you must never act dangerously. You must, you can have all these coping mechanisms for this world that's ultimately beyond your control. But if you actually try to act in that world, that's quite dangerous. And I think even on the left, and I know I haven't looked at the comments, but I'm sure people don't like it.
Well, let's look right now. Let's see what people say. Says the material dialectic situation of these drugs has gone.
Now they're all arguing with each other, so they missed that.
Yeah, no one's even paying attention to what we're saying. What I would say is, look, what with the vaccine, the assumption was that the vaccine, that spreading the vaccine, getting everyone vaccinated, would slow transmission and help everyone, overcome the virus, and that would help.
Well, yeah, that was the idea of why we needed a vaccine, but that is not what the vaccine that we actually had. That was
right. Well, now what we've discovered is that the vaccine didn't slow transmission.
But they knew that. They knew that at the beginning, and people kept saying like, "But it doesn't. It doesn't seem to be a sterilizing vaccine." They were like, "How dare you? How dare you say that?" It's like, well, no. I mean, that information was available.
There were some studies done at the very outset that suggested that it reduced transmission more effectively than masking or anything.
Because you got less sick. That was the idea.
Well, I don't know exactly why, but I mean, I remember reading that, and then it turned out no, because of the mutation of the virus, the immunity that's being picked up is not stopping infection from new versions of COVID. But the point is that, given that it didn't stop the spread, there was no justification for the overturning of individual liberty around the vaccine. That we can look back on that with some 2020 hindsight and say, no, that was
no, here's the thing. I was saying that at the time. I had that information was available. And to me, it was really shocking because I was like, everybody is proceeding as if this is something in which autonomy has no place. And people were making those arguments as though they were just well rehearsed, had nothing to do with the actual ontological nature of the vaccine. They were just proceeding as though this was about measles or something. It was that all the arguments came prepackaged. No, you can't have freedom because of this and because of herd immunity and so on. And it was like, but no. And I remember arguing at the time with the information that was available, and I was shocked. I was like, how is everybody proceeding as though this was the case? And like even now, in like Canada, you see like the odd kind of claim coming up on, I think it was on like the news or television, trying to get the last little push to get those vaccines into like children and stuff, on the basis of protecting older people. So they're still kind of doing that. The idea that you could not exercise autonomy was the main thing that characterized the entire COVID-19 pandemic, regardless of the ontology. It was like prepackaged claims, and reality came second, and reality was became rather inconvenient.
Yeah, I don't remember I do remember hearing rumors about how this virus would likely mutate in response to the vaccines, and that it would getting to zero COVID through vaccination was not going to happen. That was not going to happen. But I don't remember knowing that, or having you tell me, maybe I just ignored you, that the vaccines wouldn't majorly, in a massive way, slow the spread of COVID. That is what justified vaccination, which, by the way, in the United States was not mandatory for most people, right? I mean, it was massively encouraged.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I see a lot of bad faith arguments in the chat right now. Oh, no one was really made to do it. No, you weren't made to do it, but if you didn't do it, you were not having any kind of life. That's the thing. Like, please be honest. You really think, no, it's totally voluntary, but like if you don't do it, you just can't leave your house. And for all intents and purposes, I don't know about the United States, but like I had a friend who, like, I was vaccinated. I think vaccinations are one of the great public health discoveries of the 20th and 21st centuries. I think vaccination is wonderful. And I had a friend who like very seriously opposed this particular vaccine. And his life was just absolutely, utterly impossible. He couldn't, and he had friends who wouldn't allow him to come near them. Like his life was very, very difficult, and people are like, well, no, I mean, we're not really forced. Yeah. If you're trying to like destroy, this is so bad faith. You know what you're doing. You want people desperately to do this. And and it's like libertarian paternalism. Like they're like, no, we can maintain freedom. You just got to do the right thing, and I'm just going to nudge you. I'm going to nudge you until you do the you keep doing the wrong thing. I'm going to push you. I'm going to push you until you do the right thing. Instead of recognizing that, well, there might be some reason that maybe we should listen to. And like, there's another argument in the chat too, where someone's like, oh, does freedom mean the right to infect people? Where it's like, that's the basic assumption, right?
Well,
that when people are given freedom, they're just going to go around and be fucking stupid. That's
actually,
it.
I mean, freedom
trust people because they use their freedom to do bad things.
Most of the time, freedom does include the right to infect people.
It does, exactly, because you don't know. For the most part, we didn't know when we got someone sick in the past.
I've caught a cold in the past and been infected by somebody who was free to infect me, and no, there were no legal penalties. And freedom is, includes the right to infect people. That's not a crime. You can't be restricted in your mobility based on whether or not you wash your hands adequately or whatever. But the point is that we were told that one of the things that we should insist upon going forward, and I don't think this is going to happen, but I think people on the left could at least consistently hold to this, is that unless the the science behind a given public policy is publicly available, that would include how the development of the vaccine, the science behind the vaccine. Unless that's publicly available, it cannot be publicly. The state cannot mandate the use of it. It has to be left in the realm of private individuals, and because you're talking about not being able to make an informed decision publicly about this. So transparency would have to be absolutely insisted upon whenever you're going to be taking away people's liberty, I think. But well,
sorry, go ahead.
But yeah, so there's that. So obviously the lack of faith in the human subject and the idea that we are mature adults capable of reasoning about our own health is pervasive right now. I'm hoping that it's fading, but one of the reasons why it's pervasive is because there really is a way in which we're being developed into people who have difficulty with this, who have difficulty making reasonable decisions. And I'll just point to the people who are wearing 2 or 3 masks outside after the vaccines were introduced, or the way in which this stuff is taken up as symbolic of a tribal identity rather than an actual decision around health. So, and how often have you heard, you sound like X, you sound like Putin, you sound like Trump, you sound like Biden, you sound like Buttigieg, or whatever, when you're having a conversation with someone? Because what that is saying is the arguments that you're making are being interpreted by me primarily as symbolizing where you fit into the already determined political landscape, rather than I'm going to interpret these arguments based on their merits, their truth value in themselves. So anyway, say something now. Actually, I've run out of rant.
No, I mean, there's this whole thing where people are like, well, I was in the, I'm just looking at the chat, well, I was in the UK, or I'm in the UK, and I've got family members who weren't vaccinated and they have no problems. Yeah. Now after there was like pushback against this, but there was like serious talk for a long time of being like, well, that's it. Like we should bring in digital ID and put your vaccine stuff on it so that we know that you're safe to go into restaurants, and we'll just do this forever. Like I was in like a group chat and people were like competing with each other to be like, yeah, I don't mind. I'll do it forever to save the vulnerable and so on. But it was really about like these bad people. How dare they? It was about, it stopped even having any kind of like relationship to risk. And it became about like, how dare they became symbolic. And I talked about this before, but I was looking through like newspapers and political cartoons of like people who didn't get vaccinations, and they're all like fat, wearing red baseball caps. Like this idea of like, oh, that naughty Trump voter or that Brexit voter, or these people who just won't do what they're told, these people who are fucking up society by stubbornly putting everybody at risk. And I think like this is what it became. It was like these people who it became a kind of disciplinary tool. So yeah, now fine, don't be vaccinated. We managed to get out of that. But I was on TV at the time, and I really had to argue like the NHS cannot afford to lose tens of thousands of nurses. Like what the hell are we talking about? We had a problem where we were understaffed and so on. But in order to like push this vaccine drive, we were going to fire a whole bunch of nurses. Like that was there was very little connection. It became this kind of like disciplinary tool about these people who do not belong in these institutions because they don't have the right kinds of values. That's what it became about. And just to round this back.
I want to go ahead, but I wanted to respond to this comment when you're done here, because this got under my skin. So, but go ahead.
No, that got under my skin too. Put it back up.
Okay.
I'm
So
not
okay.
saying you're not
Go
going to
ahead.
pay attention. I'm not saying that you don't pay attention to medical professionals. I'm saying that science, I love science because it is not religion. Because you, medical professional, are also a fucking human. You're a human too, just like me. And you can show me what you have done. And I could also become a medical professional. You're not God. All right. You tell me this information is based on this, this, and this. And then I make a rational judgment about how to act. And
Right.
medical decisions anyway do not displace, or medical knowledge does not displace politics, in which we as human beings have to make a democratic decision about how we are going to live. Science doesn't necessarily just tell us that like God gave it to us. We still have to debate as a society how to live.
I want to say, like, I am actually more on the side of this person in one regard than you might expect, which is that when I go to the doctor, I don't want the doctor to say, well, you have some options. You could do this to treat your symptoms, or you could do that to treat your symptoms, or you could do this to treat your symptoms. And, it's up to you. What do you think? I want the doctor to tell me, here's how I think you should treat your symptoms. Here's a procedure you should probably do. This is what I think would be best as a doctor. Here's the pills I think you should take. I don't want them to, I want them to tell me maybe there are other options, but then I want them to make a recommendation based on them being a freaking doctor. But what I don't want is for a bunch of doctors to get together and say, as they did, because of historical racism being a major health problem in America, we have decided to endorse the mass protests against the murder of George Floyd. And because it is the health risk from racism is greater than the health risk from COVID. And because here's why I don't want them to say that. Because one, it gives away the game that they're using their status as medical experts to make political decisions, to justify political values. They're saying, because they're doing it without any medical claim about how these protests are going to have some beneficial effect on any population at all, right? There's no process there where you go, protest here, racism's overcome by June, therefore food scarcity will go away in the poorest parts of the country, and therefore no, there was no systemized justification for this. It was purely a political and moral gesture, but done based on their expertise as doctors. So what that shows is that the medical community had no trouble replacing political power and political expertise, which comes from the masses, which comes from democratically empowered masses, with their own bureaucratic, expert authority, without justifying that with reasonable arguments or the kinds of evidence that you would require to demonstrate your expertise. So they were no experts at all. They were simply a powerful political group. Well,
yeah, this is what medicalization does, right? Medicalization of everyday life means that an enormous way, not just this, I think this is an obvious thing where at least it makes sense that medical experts would have a say, right? But enormous ways of everyday life are subject to medicalization. I can think of very few policy areas that have not come to be increasingly medicalized. And what that does is it says, you're not a medical professional, so you have no say in this. And it transports these what were once political questions into the realm of medicine or of expertise or of professionals, of technocracy or whatever. And it says, no, you mere human cannot have a say on that. And I just want to show you, stop trolling me, you motherfucker. I see you. Yes, because go have a monarchy then. Go have a monarchy. Go campaign so everybody needs a degree to vote, and only vote on the particular things that you have a degree in. Okay, that's going backwards. That's not going forwards. Yes, I can talk about science because science is a human endeavor. It is not something, as I said, handed down from God. It is the wonderful thing about science is that when you had the book, the Bible, or whatever, the religious text, It wasn't even in the vernacular. It was, you just had to listen to what this person said, and you would just submit your will to that person. And what science did is that it cracked open that book so everybody could read it. And that meant it literally led to revolutions. Led to revolutions, you could say, if you want to take an idealist approach to it. But it was revolutionary. It was incredibly radical. And yes, I, as a human and as a qualitative social scientist, like any human, can have a say in that, because that's the beauty of science, is that it says, this is what I did. You, fellow human, also with a capacity for reason, can do the same thing or go through the same steps, and you should come to the same results. And if we don't, well, then that's probably not good science. It's not, this is what it is, and that's the end of the debate. No, as I said, medicine or science is a human pursuit, but also it does not evade politics. But that is how science is being used. Increasingly, social problems are being recast as health problems, as medical problems, as psychological problems. And it takes all of these things out of the realm of democratic debate. And also at the same time, it has a tendency to infantilize, to treat everybody as vulnerable, to treat everybody as essentially children forever. Because you are just an object now. You're an object of expertise. And your job is just to listen to the experts like we listen to the priests. That is not how we want to move forward. That's not how we will move forward as a society. You have to have faith in the human subject to be rational. You have to be able to convince people. You have to be able to convince everybody, the masses, to move forward. And if you can't convince them, maybe there's something wrong with you and not their brains. But it's hard to convince people in a pluralistic society. It's much, much easier to rant about people being anti-science or whatever. Instead, we have to get back to politics and democracy and having faith in humanity as being capable of living in a democratic society. We're going to go backwards. We're not going to go forwards.
So someone says, people like Ashley hung up about anti-vax victimhood. We're all victims, but the ruling class are doing away with required masking workplace vax and are content with 23,000 dead in U.S. in 2023. I guess from COVID, because there's more than that probably overall. Here's the thing about this argument. If you follow, from what I understand, if you follow the development of COVID, the way it's been mutating, and the current state of COVID, we are now being hit by a variant which can get past natural immunity and which can get past the vaccine with equal ease. So the vaccine does not protect you from this variant. If you think that getting vaccinated will help you escape from the likelihood of being infected and getting so sick that you end up in the hospital or dying, then you should get vaccinated. But someone else getting vaccinated will not slow the rate of infection, according to the CDC, nor will it protect you against getting infected. There's also been some studies that came out that showed that mask mandates have had no real effect in slowing the rate of infection. So
although everybody's questioning those studies now, we're kind of in that cycle.
Right. But I mean, nonetheless, it's not by any means completely concluded that had a tremendous effect on slowing the rate of infection. So if you want to, I think it would probably be wise to follow kind of common courtesy, which is if you are symptomatic, don't go to work if you can avoid going to work, and wear a mask, sure. But mask mandating hasn't been demonstrated conclusively to have had a major impact, and neither is vaccination at this point. So it doesn't to say, oh, the capitalists are, getting rid of these restrictions, and therefore we should want them because the capitalists are getting rid of these restrictions. Misses the fact that what we want first is to have people be free enough to and empowered enough to make decisions about their lives when it should be a private decision, and it should be a private decision when it's only about your own health. I think rather than your impact on the community. I wouldn't want to give everyone the right to dump radioactive waste in their backyard. I would want that to be regulated and stopped. But if someone wants to smoke cigarettes and put radiation into their lungs, I don't think that I should be, demanding that they don't. And I certainly shouldn't demand that, they don't, based on how that might affect me. Might give me cancer if there's no evidence that it would. I mean, I know there's an argument about secondhand smoke and whatever.
Yeah, so this is what winds up happening. So first you have in order to depoliticize something, you medicalize it. And so because people will say, oh, well, I should be free to do X, Y, Z because it's just an effect to me. And then, of course, everybody knows the argument. The counter argument to that is that your freedom to swing your fists ends where my nose begins. So when we have this kind of desire to depoliticize things and kind of introduce more and more restrictions, there's an enormous kind of, I suppose, cottage industry of harm creation in terms of secondary harms. So, for example, there was this very interesting paper by Adam Burgess on passive drinking. Have you ever heard of passive drinking?
No. Tell me about passive drinking. And is this the way that I could maybe get drunk and avoid having to pay for my beers? Is that what
no, because in the UK, secondhand smoke is called passive smoking. Mm-hmm. So the idea was that people would say, oh, look, I should have the freedom to smoke because it's my body and it's my choice. And then the idea was the sort of anti-tobacco claims makers were like, well, no, because of secondhand smoke. And so they did all of this research to then say no. And it's still to this day quite controversial to the extent to which secondhand smoke, especially in passing kind of on the street or whatever, affects people. Right. Certainly long-term exposure to very heavy smoking is not good. But anyways, there was this. So anyway, but the idea was no, because you're harming other people. But then the success of that kind of led to this explosion of attempts to sort of piggyback on that successful narrative. And so some policymaker got the idea that, well, we should try to curtail alcohol consumption. I don't know why policymakers just have this thing. They even pay lobby groups lobby groups to lobby themselves. It's called sock puppeting. Mm-hmm. I can't speak. Sock puppeting. Well, they pay lobby groups to lobby themselves for policies that they already want. So a lot of these anti-alcohol studies are done by these sock puppets. But anyway, so this policymaker has this idea oh, well, we should care about alcohol because yes, you have the freedom to drink, but you are passive drinking. Your drinking passively affects other people in your life when you come home drunk and blah, blah, blah. And so the harm to other people was this reason. Now, I'm sure that people feel a connection to that because and they'll go, oh, yes, alcohol, blah, blah, blah. It does all these things. Yes. Okay. Very large amounts of alcohol consumption on a regular basis is obviously not good for individuals or their families or whatever. But it was this reason to sort of reduce the freedom to consume alcohol. And there's another attempt to reduce or really kind of remove the freedom to drink alcohol. It was women who were pregnant or could become pregnant should avoid alcohol.
Wait, I think that's most women, right? Could.
Yeah. Everybody between the ages of 13 and 50 something. Avoid alcohol, ladies. So the thing is now on the left, as I've said, we've embraced safetyism. We have embraced vulnerability as a reaction to this sense that, oh, capitalism wants us. There's a long history of why there's been an embrace of vulnerability. It works. It gets people's attention. We don't feel a connection to particular constituencies. I can't talk to a group of libertarians or communists or religious groups or whatever. You're going to talk to people at this sort of medical level of the body and so on. And so people will talk about victims and they'll use this sort of melodramatic language when they want something done. So they'll talk about victims who suffer horribly and very black and white thinking and villains who are wholly evil. So this sort of ideology of victimhood became very, very powerful in left-wing movements. It's also partially the legacy of the civil rights movement. The success of the civil rights movement led to this search for like additional groups to which you could spread rights to, which is good. But also the sort of breaking up of movements into these sort of single issue campaigns led to sort of competing claims for victimhood as opposed to like a united front. And this is something that people warned about, you know, Bayard Rustin warned about in the 1960s, that identity politics was fracturing movements, like as people were kind of searching for different victim groups. But it was successful, right? It gets attention. And when I can't talk to people on a shared basis of whatever politics, I will talk to them on the basis of, well, as a good person, surely you care about victims. But the end result then is this, as I said, this cottage industry of harm creation, of people just manufacturing gazillions of different harms and doing kind of junk science to justify removing the freedom to do X, Y, Z because of some kind of claims-making campaign. But the end result has been a generalized embrace of safety and a generalized problematization of freedom and an increasingly misanthropic outlook. But the misanthropic outlook, as I said, doesn't come from here. As I've said many times, the general kind of misanthropy and anti-democratic impulse comes from a kind of the loss of any kind of structural way of making sense of social problems, and the rise of therapy culture and psychologization and older forms of the translation of older forms of social pathology and eugenics and so on into these new kinds of soft kind narratives, which are still the same kind of thing, like the individual is a sickness on society. And so we have this very individualized way of making sense of social problems, like they grow out of your brain. And then, of course, when your intervention doesn't work, people just get more and more frustrated about humanity. And we have an extremely misanthropic outlook. At the same time, I feel like this anti-democratic ethos has always haunted our societies. It's not, you know, on the left, we've
I'm going to
embraced
be
safetyism,
anti-democratic
embraced
right now.
vulnerability. What?
I'm going to be anti-democratic right now and point out that we're about 6 minutes past the 1 hour, and
Doug, I'm trying to rant here. Like I'm giving. Can you?
You're doing great. You're doing great. But we're 6 minutes past the hour, and we're now late for our parent room, which is already scheduled. And if we're going to be safe and keep people from being traumatized by having to wait for us and the other stream for the paying patrons, then I'm going to have to cut this off right here. But
okay.
In the second in the second stream, we will continue to rant. I will maybe even try to play a devil's advocate position against you for a little while, Ashley. I'm not sure if I'm, if I'm too much of a coward to do that, or if I have the bravery.
Do it, Doug. I need it. I need
All
it. Just makes me angrier.
Okay, great. All right. So let the hate flow through you, Ashley. All right. So I'm protecting all the listeners from harm. We don't want to traumatize you. We'll be about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll jump onto the Patreon stream. I will put a link to that Patreon stream in the comments on this video.
Yeah, and there's comments here that I want to respond to, like the victimhood complex carries over to anti-vax people. That is true. That's absolutely true. All right, sorry, go on.
That's fine. So can you grab those things so I can play the viewer mail theme in the other stream? All right. So goodbye, everybody. We'll see you on the other stream.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential